Now I'm pleased to introduce Joydeep Roy-Bhattacharya. Mr. Roy-Bhattacharya was born and educated in India and now lives in New York, where he has taught at Bard College and SUNY Albany, among other schools. His first novel, The Gabrielle Club, was published in 16 countries in 8 languages and received wide acclaim for its combination of murder mystery intrigue and political and philosophical debate. His new novel, his first to be published in the US, in the beginning of a cycle of novels set in the Islamic world, is The Storyteller of Marrakesh. A recent review in the New York Times Book Review calls it an enigmatic fable in the tradition of the 1001 Nights, and notes that Mr. Roy-Bhattacharya has clearly immersed himself in the richness of Moroccan life and history.
Do you know, this is my first American book tour, and I thought, as part of the tour, I'd do something that is quite common in Europe, which is invite local writers to read alongside me. And I'm really pleased to be able to do that here at the Harvard Bookstore, where there is a young writer who is on staff, Mike Campbell. He's enormously talented and a rising star. And I asked him for his biography, and he gave me all of 4 lines. So I'm going to have to riff on this. Mike Campbell had a story in Microchondria, Harvard Bookstore's original anthology of microfiction. He is also the editor of Meeting House, an online journal of writing from New England, where he has shamelessly published some of his own stories. He was featured in the TV series Lost. I'll stop there. It is my privilege and pleasure to invite Mike to read to you.
Hi. I want to thank Joydeep for this opportunity. It's really gracious and cool of him. And really quickly put in a plug for my website, Meeting House. It is an online journal of writing from New England. We've been doing a site redesign, but we're going to be premiering the new look soon. We're really excited, so check us out, meetinghousemag.com. We'd love some fresh writing. So I'm just going to read something short that I've been working on. I want to tell a nice story, a story wherein good things happen to good people. For the next few minutes, I'll try and set aside my suspicion that it is only in stories of loss, pain, and brokenness that we find meaning, and I will make room for joy and redemption. So, there was a woman who had lived a pleasant and easy life. She had a career that was fulfilling and financially rewarding. She lived in a tastefully decorated condominium in a fashionable part of the city. She had a husband she adored, and in her 35th year, she was pregnant with a boy, her son. She was the envy of her friends. Her parents approved of all her life choices. One night in the 5th month of her pregnancy, the woman's husband came home and walked into the living room where she was watching the news. He didn't take off his coat. He told his wife that he wasn't ready to be a father, didn't know if he would ever be ready, and though he knew it was selfish and cowardly, he was leaving that night. He didn't ask for forgiveness or understanding. He promised that she would have no trouble getting his share of the child support, and walked out. Then the woman was alone, angry and hurt. Her friends held her hand and called her husband a bastard. Her parents told her to come home. She continued to go to work and to attend her birthing classes. She began to fear the life in her womb, which once she had felt as an incarnation of love, but which now seemed only a constant reminder of betrayal and pain. Inside her, the boy grew and remained unnamed. In the apartment next to the woman's lived an older man. He and the woman shared a wall and knew each other's faces in the elevator and collections of noises and drifting cooking smells. The man had lived alone for almost 30 years, widowed and childless since his wife and young son had died in a car crash that hadn't really been anyone's fault. The man had withdrawn to live with his grief, confident that his life would never again be as good as it once had been, and that he would die alone and quickly be forgotten. He and the woman lived in comfortable anonymity. Late one night, the woman's labor began with a swiftness and degree of pain for which her books and classes had failed to prepare her. She cried out in her bed. The man in his own bed on the other side of the wall heard the woman and recognized the sound immediately, though it had been decades since he'd last heard a cry of similar pitch and intensity. He got out of bed and quickly dressed, then went out into the hallway and knocked on the woman's door. "Hello," he said. "It's your neighbor. If you open your door, I will help you. My car is right out front." The woman heard the man and rose from her bed, clutching her stomach as she made her way to the front door. She let the man in and pointed to her overnight bag, packed and waiting in the hall closet. The man picked up the bag and held the woman around her waist. She put her arm around his shoulders as they walked to the elevator. Down on the street, the man helped the woman into the back seat of his car, where she lay down. The man got behind the wheel and asked the woman where her doctor was. She gave the name of a nearby hospital, then gritted her teeth and groaned through a contraction. The man sped away from the curb, "Breathe," he said. "I'm breathing," the woman replied. 10 minutes later, they were at the hospital. The man helped the woman into the reception area, and she gripped his hand and didn't let go when the nurses put her on a gurney. The man shuffled along as the woman was wheeled to a delivery room. The doctor entered and looked over the woman's vitals, checked her dilation, and said it was time. The woman huffed and screamed and crushed the man's hand, and everyone told her what a good job she was doing. And then, a short while later, though not as short as the woman might have liked, the boy was out and swallowed and placed in her arms. The mother looked at the child and touched his sticky face. "He's beautiful," the man said. "What will you name him?" "I don't know," the woman said. "What's your name?" The man told her his name and thought how strange it was that two people could share so much without a proper introduction. "That will be my son's name too," the woman said. The woman was comforted by the knowledge that her son had the name of a man who had done a small, good thing. She looked at the child and forgot about her pain and her loss and felt only love. And the man looked at the mother and child and felt an unfamiliar joy and peace, knowing that these two at least would remember him, and that he would live for a time in the story of the boy's name. What else could she want? What more could he? Thank you.
I should probably tell you that Mike's parents drove down from New Hampshire to be at this reading, and they are... Thank you. As far as... Sorry? As far as possible, I am trying to do this tour supporting independent bookstores, which, as you can probably guess, are under tremendous threat from you-know-who.com. And I think as much as these stores provide us with the space to do our reading and flog our books, the least we can do in return is to promote them. I'd like to give you a brief background about myself. Obviously from India. I published my first novel 11 years ago. My formal background is in philosophy, not in fiction. The novel was set in Eastern Europe and dealt with the Velvet Revolutions, and I was, as you heard, published in many countries in many languages, but not in the United States, because it was the heyday of Indian writing in English, and I proved to be a marketing problem for American publishers with my name living in America, writing about Europe. I was very strongly advised to write that Indian book. I decided after a year of trying to break through here to move to Germany, which was my major market, took the American publishers' advice to heart and spent the next 6 years working on a 2,400-page manuscript set in Germany between the wars. It is now being whittled down to a manageable size. I came back to the States because I realized that at a certain point in time, two things were happening. I was beginning to think in German, which for a writer in English can be a little awkward. A friend of mine pointed out that I was beginning to refer to Freud in the present tense, and I realized perhaps that kind of immersion in Hitler's Germany was not such a good thing, although the impetus for that project was to find out how a democratic society could turn into what Germany did in the 1930s, with an eye, of course, to what has been happening in America. I came back and was horrified, absolutely flabbergasted by the incredible simplification and bastardization of an entire culture, which is, of course, Muslim culture in this country, by fundamentally illiterate talking heads. And I am, of course, being diplomatic when I say that. I am not Muslim, but I grew up in India, which has the third largest Muslim population in the world. And of course, with 57 countries and more than 1 billion people, it is a bit of a stretch to call all Muslims terrorists, as is often done on TV. I decided to write a novel precipitated by a trip to Morocco. Having lived in Germany and spent winters in Sweden for 6 years, I felt the need for a warm climate. And I went to Morocco and experienced the cliche that many people have experienced when they go to Marrakesh. I did not write all along the watchtower as Hendrix did, but I did go to the city and the square that then provoked this novel, and I'll talk about it a little more when I actually read from it. But having written that book and realized that despite having lived in a country with a sizable Islamic constituency, having realized my own ignorance, I felt the need to write more. And I started a second novel, which was precipitated by a real-life event, which was the incineration of the oldest literary cafe in the Middle East, in Baghdad, in March 2005, by a truck bomber, which in turn led to the going up in flames of the oldest extant book market in the world, around a street called Al-Mutanabi Street. And this second novel, called The Book of Baghdad, takes this event as its point of departure. And I take a poet and a writer who die in the cafe, and having safely disposed of the problem of mortality, I take them through the afterlife, through various manifestations of the city of Baghdad, in an attempt to communicate how much of our present civilization we owe to the Abbasi Caliphate. Being of a somewhat perverse mentality, I was not satisfied after I wrote that book and decided to go on and write a third, and was fortunate enough to find an agent who believed in the project and an editor who, at W.W. Norton, who bought it as a three-book literary project, a three-book literary contract, which in the present economy, you will probably understand, is a rather rare thing. There were no vampires in the books, and they were not set in Sweden. Although it was a temptation when you write a book in the afterlife. I mean, one could always smuggle in a vampire or two, werewolf, movie rights, and so forth. 2 months after signing the three-book contract and well into writing and almost finishing that book on the afterlife, I started falling ill, and I didn't realize that. I blamed it on stress and overwork, and the shock of actually having a three-book contract, I suppose. Well, it turned out I was very, very, very ill, and 1.5 years later was sitting across a neurologist who told me I had 4 months left. I shared that knowledge with my publisher and my editor, and they pointed out the small matter of the three-book contract. 1.5 years later, I am living evidence of the proof that a tough editor can actually work miracles. But having been chained to my desk for the last 11 months or so, I was in a wheelchair till November. It was very, very good, a very good environment to not just stop at 3 books. So the first cycle with Norton comprises of the Storyteller of Marrakesh, which I'm going to read from today, which deals with the tradition of oral communal storytelling, which Islamic culture has preserved. The second book, as you learned, deals with the heritage in sciences and arts of the Muslim Caliphate. And the final book, which is set in Isfahan and is called Like a Perfect Circle Drawn on Water, which was the instruction given by a master Turkish calligrapher to his students, deals with the great Islamic arts of calligraphy and Sufi poetry, and I do incorporate examples of both within the text. In other words, this entire cycle is intended to communicate through fiction the heritage of the Muslim world, because I think fiction has the capacity to do what nonfiction and journalism does not, and I'm hoping that you will then ask me during the question and answer session why I think so. But I also felt the need to address the collision that has been taking place over the last 20 years between specifically America and the Muslim world. And I felt the need to write, if that was the peace cycle, I felt the need to address the element of war. And I thought the best way to examine how this is done in American creative writing would be to read books that deal with the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and was rather surprised to find that regardless of, I believe, the MFA program is now de rigueur if you want to be a writer in this country. Regardless of the many, many creative writing programs, there is not a single work of fiction written by an American on the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. There is a fantastic book of poetry, which I will buy later today because I found it here. Here, Bullet by an active duty soldier in Iraq. But no work of fiction, and I don't understand that. People are apparently still writing about Vietnam. Matterhorn was very big last year, and Tree of Smoke by Dennis Johnson the year before. But I literally had to start from scratch as an Indian writer living in America, once again doing something that apparently has not been done. And I have never held a gun in my life. I have not been in the army. And I turned to a very good friend of mine, Chris Hedges, who has written about war and very eloquently. I mean, there's been a lot of journalism and a lot of nonfiction accounts, and asked him if he could introduce me to some active duty American soldiers, and he did. And I think the most rewarding part of the last 1 year for me has been to write a novel set in Afghanistan, from which I will read to you, where my collaborators in terms of technical foolproofing have been 4 US Army officers in Afghanistan who have just been absolutely brilliant, sincere, dedicated, non-judgmental. And it's been interesting for me to be in an intense relationship with 4 young people, because they're all in their 20s, knowing that they might be dead the next time I hear about them. And I was enormously moved and almost struck dumb when, at my reading in Barnes & Noble last Thursday, and I have not met any of these people, just faces and just names to me. One of them actually came to the reading. He had leave of, he was on leave, and he was in New York. And people have asked me why I have, as a non-Muslim, felt the need to write, one novel is one thing, 2 novels is another, but this seems like a never-ending project, and my mother, among others, is getting very distressed. And I can only make a very somber analogy. We're only a few days ago from what happened in Tucson with the death of little Christina Green. And the president gave an eloquent and beautiful speech about her aspirations and the America she would have imagined. And it was very moving, as it ought to be. On the same day, 12 civilians were killed in Pakistan, in North Waziristan. Of course, they were termed insurgents, but of those 12, 3 were children between the ages of 4 and 6. And we know nothing about them. We know nothing about their dreams, nothing about their aspirations. If you see their photographs online, they look as if they've been baked. And I suppose the reason I am writing these books, the reason I've been consumed to write these books, is to give voice to the voiceless. But fact is always stranger than fiction. And I suppose in my endeavor, I had never realized that the voiceless would include the unfortunate 1% of the American population that is sent back again and again and again to fight America's wars. So I would like to read to you from the first war novel. This is actually novel 4, but it's probably going to be the next one coming out after Storyteller. It's called Antigone in Kandahar. It is based on the Greek myth. That is the formal framing. And it's set entirely in a US forward base in the mountains north of Kandahar. It's a novel in 7 voices, 2 Afghan and 5 American, all soldiers. I will read from the chapter entitled Antigone, which begins the novel. In the novel, Antigone, along with her family, was hit by one of these drones and lost her legs. And she has appeared in front of the fort, the forward base, to claim the body of her brother, who was killed in an attack against the fort. Now, the attack was an act of badla, or revenge, because the brother was trying to get back at the Americans who killed his family. And so here she is in front of the fort. It is early morning, and she has just crossed the mountains to demand the return of her brother's body. And if this obviously has deliberate echoes of Sophocles, as does the entire novel. The forward base itself is forward base Darsandan, which in Pushtun means fear. 1, 2, 3, 4. I count the moments and say the basmala in my head. In the name of God, most gracious, most merciful. It's up to me now. I'm scared, my hands are shaking, my mouth is dry. I cast a look back at the mountains where I have spent my life, where I was born, where my family died. All my family, that is, except my brother, Yusuf. I remember what Yusuf said yesterday before he set off to storm the fort. There are times when, in order to be master of a situation, you have to go mad and keep your head at the same time. I remember this as I turned the wheels of my cart and trundled down the sloping track to the square field enclosing the fort. They've leveled everything here. There are no trees, no vegetation, not a semblance of shade. The earth is dry and cracked and already scorching hot despite the early hour. Dust swirls about me. The sun blazes down on the drab earthenworks of the fort. The ground is scored with boot marks and the tracks of many vehicles. Piled up on one side of the fortifications is a jumble of rubbish, discarded oil cans, bent iron posts, plastic bags and buckets. The only signs of life are occasional metallic glints reflecting the rising sun and a vertical line of smoke. This arid landscape cannot be more different from the fertile green valley I started out from. It's a desolate prospect, made even more so by its present associations. And yet, I've spent my entire overnight journey across the mountains waiting for this sight. As I push against the ground with my hands to propel the cart forward, I remember the precarious mountain trails, and am myself at a loss to account for how I've made it here, with nothing more than the strength of my puny arms and shoulders. Some of my muscles are raw to the touch like open wounds, others are as stone, dead to all sensation. The stumps of my legs have begun to bleed. Only recently healed, the constant thrusting forward entailed by my journey has rubbed the sutures raw. I ignore the pain. I ignore everything except for the fact of my being here. I tell myself that I am here because my heart is huge and my tenderness real. I am here to bury my brother according to the tenets of my faith. That is all there is to it. A body covered with buzzing flies bars my path. With a sense of unreality, I lean out of my cart and turn it over. It isn't Yusuf, but a youth lying with his face down and a bullet hole through his forehead. Blood has congealed over one eye, the other is closed. I let him go and recite the Shahada over him. Some distance away, another body lies in a huddle. It's Rahmat, one of Yusuf's men, his black turban unraveling in loops as I raise his head. Rahmat was immensely strong. He could lift an entire oak log with one hand. Now the lifeless hand rests limply against mine. I let him go and sat back in the cart. A flock of crows wheels impatiently in the air. High overhead, a vulture flaps its wings and prepares to land. A flag in a corner of the fort snaps like gunshot in the breeze. Already I feel worn out. My brother was a fool to attack here. Behind its multiple barriers of barbed wire, sandbags, and mud and stone walls, the fort looks impregnable. I move forward and approach the third and last body lying in the field. It's Bahram Gul, the oldest of Yusuf's companions, who once brought me a posy of mountain daisies when I was a child. His open mouth is unnaturally red, his hennaed beard encrusted with crimson muck. Bahram loved to sing. Then the Talib came and he fell silent and tended to his fields. But lately he'd taken up singing again. His voice echoes through my head as I leave him behind. Bahram's daughter, Anisa, was my closest friend before she died in childbirth. Now they will meet again. I envy them the good fortune of their reunion. A puff of dust kicks up from the ground to my left. I see it out of the corner of my eye before I smell its burning scent and hear the high-pitched ringing sound. My brain dulled from my recent exertions, I keep pushing myself forward until a second puff kicks up fiercely to my right. That's when it dawns on me that I'm being fired at. When the third bullet shrills past, I come to a stop. The silence seems to last a lifetime. The shadow of a solitary cloud drifts across the land. I reach up and touch the taweez around my neck. Many years ago, Father had brought back a written prayer from the shrine of a Sufi pir near Zaran Sharan. and I've worn it sewn into a leather pouch ever since. Now its softness reassures me. Instead of looking at the fort to see who's firing at me, I cast a glance back at the mountains. They stand like faithful sentinels in the sky, their enormity dwarfing everything. When I turn around again and look at the fort, it seems shrunken in contrast and no longer as intimidating. I see it for what it really is, a rudimentary structure slapped together with mud, sandbags, and drywall, an alien accretion. I hold up one of Yusuf's white shirts and wave it in the air. Moments later, a metallic voice echoes across the square and asks me what I want. Se guare, it asks. Although it speaks Pashto, the voice has a distinct Tajik ring to it. I'm not surprised. I estimate the distance to the fort. It is far. I make my own voice big and answer that I am here to bury my brother who was killed in the battle yesterday. I am his sister, I call out. My name is Nizam. There is a lull, and then the voice asks, "What is your brother's name?" I tell them. Once again, there is a silence. I try to picture how they must see me from their side, a small, shrouded figure in a wooden cart slung low on the ground. I imagine their surprise. I must take advantage of it. The voice breaks the silence. I detest its metallic gargle. It asks, "Who told you that you could find him here?" I reply, "Those who survived the battle." "What does he look like?" I feel the weight of my answer as intensely as the burden of my brother's death, but I manage to control my emotions and describe Yusuf, taking care to be precise. After a moment, the voice returns. "Your brother is being held for purposes of identification." "I can identify him," I reply. "You must leave. He will be identified by people coming from afar, experts. Then he will be buried." "When will they arrive?" "Soon." "How soon?" "In 2 days." "That cannot be," I answer, trying not to let my emotion choke my voice. "Yusuf must be given a proper burial. That's why I'm here. Our business with him is not finished." "He is dead. What possible business can you have with him?" "He was a terrorist, a Talib, and a Bad Sarai." "That isn't true. My brother was a Pashtun hero, a mujahid, and a freedom fighter. He fought the Talib, and he died fighting the Amrikai invaders. He was a brave man." "You are as misguided as he was, Pashtana. You've no place here. Go away." "I've brought a white shroud," I answer. "I will ask you for water to wash him, as is my right. I will dig the grave and place him in it with his head facing the Qibla. Then I will say a prayer, pour 3 handfuls of soil over him, and recite, 'We created you from it and returned you into it, and from it we will raise you a second time.' After that I will leave, I promise. Do not deny me this duty that I must perform." In the space of silence that follows, I lower my eyes and gaze at the stumps of my legs, wrapped in goatskins held together with puttees and rags. The goatskins have stained red. My legs, hitherto numb, have begun to burn and sting. Eventually the voice replies, sounding surprised but also slightly derisive. "You are a woman. You have no role in a Muslim burial. We are many men here. We'll take care of it. I've asked the Amrikai captain who commands the fort. He's an honorable man. He gives you his word." I lower my improvised white flag. "I will not leave," I answer. My voice shakes with anger and fatigue. I'm close to tears. There's an electric crackle as the megaphone shuts off and I'm left wondering. A crow flaps across my line of sight and I realize that I am surrounded by carrion birds. Then a shot rings out and a vulture keels across the sky and falls to the ground. The next time I look up, I'm startled to see 4 men slip out of a gate embedded in the high walls. They come to a standstill behind the barbed wire with their guns pointed in my direction. The only one of them not dressed in a uniform is a wild-eyed, gangling boy not much older than me, whom I surmise to be the Tajik interpreter. He's the first to speak. "What are you doing here, you stupid woman?" He blurts out in a nervous, indignant voice that's markedly different from its omnipotent metallic incarnation. "Didn't you read the signs? You could have been shot." "I am not lettered," I tell him, forcing myself to be calm. He brushes off my reply with an exasperated wave of his hand. My sense of him is of someone trying to play an adult, manifestly out of league for the part he's been chosen to perform. The captain, he says importantly, gesturing at a short, stocky man, would like you to know that he has no quarrel with you. But you've exaggerated your role and you must leave. This is a battleground. It isn't a place for women's hysterics. I decide to ignore him and focus on his companions. I watch them without expression as they stand there, burdened with their guilt and lies. The officer steps out in front, flanked by 2 helmeted soldiers. All 3 wear bulky jackets and dark glasses, and I imagine they must be stifling in this hot weather. I'm too far to make out their features, and as the captain turns away from me and addresses the Tajik, the soldiers raise their guns and aim at me. The captain's terse voice, the jittery interpreter, and the 2 wary soldiers all suggest the cautious bearing of a group of fighting men caught in an unprecedented situation. Clearly, I pose a dilemma for them. I am a woman in their man's world, and they don't know how to proceed. That's probably coming here at the end of the year. Very different book today, Storyteller of Marrakesh. A much gentler book, kinder, 1,000 Points of Light. I went to Marrakesh for the first time 3 years ago, and it was winter, and the city is dominated by 3 features, and they sort of coterminous. They exist next to each other. The Qutubiyya Mosque with a single minaret, square-shaped, the oldest mosque in the Maghreb, and the souks, the covered bazaars, which are almost 1.5 mile in radius, and in between the Jema el-Fana, the central square, which has remained more or less unchanged since the founding of the city more than 700 years ago. Jema el-Fana means both assembly of the dead and empty space, and the word Jema has become synonymous with mosque because it signifies the open space in front of a mosque. The Jema el-Fana is a Janus-faced creature, and it is really the main character in the book. During the daytime, it's a farmer's market. You probably have one here in Boston. After sundown, it becomes this, you literally slide back in time to the Middle Ages, and it becomes this open-air performing space, visual artists, storytellers, snake charmers, sword swallowers, everything under the sun, and performing routines that have more or less remained unchanged over the centuries. But as the hours grow older, the circus turns into something a little more sinister. It becomes, to put it quite crudely, a pickup joint. There are men cruising. If you are unfortunate enough to be a Western woman, you're pretty much guaranteed to get groped. It's my girlfriend at the time and I were absolutely entranced by this place because she was a drummer, and that's the first sign, the first sense of the Jema is you can hear it after sundown from almost a mile away because of the drum circles, and the earth literally throbs. Although when you're actually in the square, there are many drum circles from different parts of Africa. They all have their own rhythms, but somehow the further you go from the square, the drums merge. It was just enthralling to be there. Fruit stalls, food stalls. A little kid snatches your hand and draws something with henna on it, even if you haven't asked, and you say, "Don't do that." And he said, "Yes, but I've already done my work. I need to be paid." And suddenly, so you're lost here, reveling in traveling back in time and so forth, and suddenly it reveals a different character. But I was personally fascinated by the fact that the person who had the performer who had one of the largest crowds was a storyteller. And he was flanked by, at a distance, by someone doing things with a snake that I cannot describe in polite company, and someone swallowing flaming swords. And still, he had the largest crowd. So it was like my reading flanked by Stieg Larsson on one hand and Stephanie, what's her name, on the other, right? Twilight, and having the largest crowd. So it was a bit of a, I don't know, I just felt good about it. But what was interesting was this was a form of storytelling I'd never heard before, because he would read, fall silent, and then someone from the audience, you for instance, would pick it up and read. And then someone else would read. So it was a form of communally making the story. And I'd, of course, known about this as being the genesis of the epics in every culture. And it was the first time I'd actually witnessed this. And I don't know the Moroccan or Arabic. And I went back the second day with an interpreter and realized that indeed that was what was going on. They were all participating in the story making, so to speak. And I stayed right till the end, which was about 4 a.m. And I walked up to him and I asked him, he asked me what I did for a living. And I said, I'm a writer. He said, well, what kind of writer? And I said, well, I write books. So he said, so you kill words. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, well, words are like butterflies. They are meant to fly. And the moment you pin them to the page, they're dead. So that these books contain corpses, which is one way of looking at it. But what was fascinating for me is, as a student of philosophy, he was articulating almost exactly the same words that you hear Socrates speaking in the Phaedrus, in Plato's Phaedrus. Socrates with his suspicion of writing. And I realized that here was an example of a form of storytelling that no longer exists. It used to exist in India and South Asia, but was killed off by black and white films. Then TV soaps have done it in North Africa and places like Afghanistan. The reason it has survived in Marrakesh is there is still a trade in salt between Marrakesh, Timbuktu, and Jannah. And although these are camel caravans, and as those of you who, travel by camel between Boston and Cambridge know, it is an ungainly creature, difficult to travel in the Sahara during the daytime because of the heat, so they travel at night. And as much as a cook or a trader or the person who looks after the camels has a function in the caravan, the storyteller does too. I mean, they travel at night, and his purpose is to begin the theme from the front camel, and then it passes down from person to person, camel to camel, so to speak, to the last camel in the caravan, and these caravans can grow from anywhere between 10 to 500. And then it comes back again. And it keeps them active, it keeps them imaginative, it does all the things that Socrates guaranteed it would do. And of course, Socrates' suspicion of writing was very simple. He thought written knowledge would equal power, as indeed did happen in Greece when the tyrant who caused the Homeric epics to be written down then proclaimed his ownership over the epics. And therefore, people no longer had ready access to these things that until that time was part of the oral culture in their heads. And the Greeks at that time were going through the kind of transition that we are going through now in our daily battles with the amount of time we spent online. In the transition between literary culture and web culture, 2,500 years ago, it was transition between oral and written culture. And most people don't know that we've been literate for far less time than we've been an oral culture. And we actually had, at one time, Google search engines in our heads. But as we know now, much as the tyrant of Athens monopolized knowledge and, designated what you could and could not read, we face the same problem in terms of WikiLeaks, for instance, where apparently there are things that are beyond our purview. So here was a person who was keeping that tradition alive, and I presume much of his audience was schooled in this tradition. These storytelling sessions start once the sun falls. There is a very elaborate way of determining, and it's totally random, what story is going to be told that day. But in this particular novel and on this particular day, the story relates to an actual circumstance, an actual event, which is the disappearance of a tourist couple, the two of you, for instance, in the Jema, and the storyteller's own headstrong, erratic younger brothers are being arrested for their disappearance, and being arrested because he volunteered that he was responsible. And the storyteller is convinced that the brother is covering up, and this is not true. So once a year, he brings together all the witnesses to this event and tries to stitch together what happened, the chronicle of what happened. So the Jema El-Fana. And by the way, the other question I asked the storyteller is, what matters to you in telling the story? And he said, well, the truth. So I asked him, what is the truth? And he said, well, that's the story. And I used that as the beginning of the novel. What matters in the end is the truth. And yet, when I think about the event that marked the end of my youth, I can only come to one conclusion, that there is no truth. Perhaps there is reason to believe the philosopher who realized, to his dismay, that the truth is precisely that which is transformed the instant it is revealed, becoming thereby only one of many possible opinions, open to debate, disagreement, controversy, but also inevitably to mystification. In other words, there is no truth. Put differently, truth is that which inevitably contradicts itself. Perhaps that is what is borne out by my story in the end. That might explain why, instead of the truth, I offer you a greater consolation, a dream. Msalakir. Good evening. Permit me to introduce myself. My name is Hassan. I am a storyteller, monarch of a realm vaster than any you can envisage, that of the imagination. My memory is not what it used to be. But if we can settle on a democratic price, I will tell you a tale the like of which I promise you have never heard before. It is a love story, like all the best stories. But it's also a mystery, for it concerns the disappearance of one of the lovers, or the other, or perhaps both of them, or neither. It happened 2 years ago, or it might have been 5 or 10 or 25. These details are unimportant. The pink dust hung suspended in the air that evening just as it does tonight. The light from the spice and fruit stalls cast bright plumes like desert wraiths. The restless throbbing of drums rose and fell like bodies in the sand. And in the end, the events surrounding the lovers brought an entire fabled city to a standstill and transformed forever the character of its renowned meeting place, the Jema El-Fana, perhaps the most storied, most mysterious city square in the world. Let me repeat, the truth of my story is immaterial, as is whether or not a woman vanished, or a man, or both of them, or neither. What matters in the end is life, the breathing of air, the breasting of waves, the movement of sand on dunes and surf, each grain of sand a mirror of conflicting perceptions and testimonies. What language do you speak, stranger? English? All right. I will try my best, though my French is better, and of course Arabic would be the easiest. Tell me where you're from. From far away? I see. It doesn't matter. Here in the Jema, everyone is an outsider. I don't mean to pry, but these are preliminary introductions, necessary to set the tone. Sit down, please, and join my circle of listeners. The ground may seem hard in the beginning, but I will weave a magic carpet of words that will soon take you away from this place. Permit me to pour you some mint tea to accompany my narration. We have our traditions of hospitality. There are ways in which things must be done. If I don't make you comfortable, how can I expect you to listen to what I have to say? A story is like a dance. It takes at least 2 people to make it come to life, the one who does the telling and the one who does the listening. Sometimes the roles are reversed and the giver becomes the taker. We both do the talking, we both listen, and even the silences become loaded. From a small number of perfectly ordinary words, a tapestry takes shape, suggestive of a dream, but close enough to a reality which more often than not remains elusive. It's a feat of mutual trust, of mutual imagining. What matters is whether or not we can believe each other's voices, and the test of that will lie in the story we make together. It will lie in the pieces of the past that swim into the present. Maybe it is precisely what we don't remember that will form the kernel of our tale, imparting to it its grain of truth and transforming memories into mythology. But these are ruminations that travel in circles without beginning or end, like smoke in the air. They are good for passing long, introspective evenings with friends in the green valley of Eureka in the high Atlas Mountains, where I'm from. Though I might also be from white-walled Essaouira on the Atlantic coast, or from sand-colored Zagora, where the last rock-ribbed mountain roots give way to the Sahara's golden desolation. These are all very beautiful places, and I come from them according to the needs of the particular tale I'm engaged in telling, its flavor, atmosphere, and circumstance. It's the way we set our mark, you see, with one eye on reality and one firmly fixed in fantasy. It helps to broaden the compass of the narrative, especially since I haven't traveled much, certainly not as much as you, nor, for that matter, my brother Mustafa. But I have been to Rabat and to Casablanca, and one day I intend to visit more distant places, like Meknes and Fez and Tangier and Cambridge. Fabled names, fabled cities, they have long and illustrious histories, and their attractions beckon. Meanwhile, I make this trip to Marrakesh every winter to escape the bitter cold of the highlands, the desert, or the sea, depending on where I might be that year. But also because I am driven to come to terms with what happened that night, here on the Jema, where there was a scent of something amiss in the air. And this even before the two strangers made their first, and as it turned out, final appearance, for I am haunted by them. Thank you. I trained as a philosopher, I taught philosophy, and I wrote my first novel thinking about the dissertation I was going to write. I decided to think about the dissertation I was going to write on a hitchhiking, backpacking trip from southern Germany to the Black Sea along the course of the Danube, and reflecting as well on having been present 3 years previously in 1989 during the Velvet Revolutions. I had kept a journal, and that journal turned into a novel. The dissertation somehow or the other never got written. I was fortunate enough to sell the novel and realize that this is what I wanted to do, and the rest is history. And 13 years later, I am finally published in this country, so never give up. No, I've been very ill, as you did miss that part, and I more or less was chained to my desk. I am not very good at writing in the morning. It takes me some time to sort of build steam, so to speak. I start writing in the afternoon and then carry on until I no longer can. But my routine comprises almost every day I get up and listen to Bach, and that kind of gets me in the creative phase, and I cannot write without earplugs, regardless of the fact that I live in a very quiet place. So when one is dealing with 6 books at the same time, it's an extended trance. It's I suppose a 3.5-year rave. You're sort of, there's a reason why we read War and Peace, and we do not recall the journalistic accounts of the time. For me, I'll make a musical analogy. The books that have been written on these wars, especially, there are many, and I think they are of the moment. They're very important to capture what happens until that point in time, but they capture the microcosm, and I think fiction has the strength of being able to step back and look at the macrocosm. I think nonfiction in journalism is a bit like reading a musical score. So you can hear it in your head. Think of the Goldberg Variations as an example. But reading fiction is to look and hear someone like Glenn Gould doing it. I think fiction feels, it communicates the spirit, and it transcends the event, the sort of particularity, specificity of the event contained within that fiction. So it no longer is a war, it is all wars, for instance, that one is addressing. Yeah. No, actually, when I write fiction, I cannot read fiction. I read exclusively nonfiction. And of course, there I think is the utility of nonfiction in that it gives you the facts. And with fiction, you play with the facts. I try to be a neutral voice. In the Antigone novel, I leave it up to the reader to decide. I do not skew the equation. I don't tell you what you should feel. In The Storyteller of Marrakesh, I do not employ the Western methodology, if you will, of my solving this crime on the last page, and you can sit back and admire my handiwork, or say, aha, I knew that was the case on page 3. I leave it up to you to decide, and there is a resolution, but you're going to have to work for it. This is what I call the dance, which is an active sort of partnership between the reader and the writer. I think fiction has, in a way, become very easy. It's become entertainment, and I have nothing against entertainment, but I think it can be much more engaging if you are indeed engaged.
Is that a Western phenomenon?
I think it is, yes, and it's become global. But I am influenced by, for instance, the storyteller telling me. And in fact, on day 2, I told him at the end of his session, well, what happens, and he kind of looked at me with great disdain and says, what do you mean, what happens? Well, I said, well, so what's the end? And he said, that's the problem with you foreigners. That's why you need to come back tomorrow. And I said, well, I'm leaving tomorrow. And he said, it sort of made me understand Scheherazade, and this is indeed the tradition of the Chinese box. And the equivalent to Scheherazade in South Asia is the adventures of Hamza, who's a Loki-like figure, a Puck-like figure. And Hamza held sway between the 16th century and the 1920s, when he was killed off by black and white film. And some of his adventures have been transcribed by this amazing Pakistani writer, scholar actually, in Toronto, and published by Modern Library, and that still takes up 1,000 pages. So it just sort of goes on, and some of it can become a little taxing, because of course in the West we have been trained, and we are increasingly trained to anticipate endings so we can go on. So if you start something that your grandmother was reading to you, and you're still trying to, and you're my age and still waiting to figure out what happens, Yes. Bowles was an island of productivity. Bowles went native, if one can say that, in Morocco, and was very, very faithful to the Moroccan voice. And he was host to an entire generation of American writers whose training in writing was precisely to go abroad and travel. I think sort of the equivalent of the MFA today. And I think it was a better training. Because unless you live and unless you read and read and read, I mean, you're not going to grow as a writer. So Bowles played host to Jack Kerouac, to Tennessee Williams. I mean, it's like a who's who of American writing who visited him and stayed with him. So yes, absolutely. In fact, I would say to a certain extent in writing this book, he has been an inspiration. Not so much The Sheltering Sky as a book that has spider in the title. And of course, Spider's Web, I think, something like that, yeah. Does that imply that I ought to be comfortable with the fact that I'm Indian and therefore write about India? No. No, I don't understand. I think it is a publisher's, it's a marketing, they put us into ghettos. So you have especially in this country, you have your representative Chinese American writers, Indian American writers, Dominican American writers, Puerto Rican American writers, and one writes about what one is passionate about, right? And my relationship with my country is very, very complicated, and there are Indian writers coming out of the woodworks every year, and I feel no incentive or pressure to do that. I mean, I will probably write a book set in India, if only to please my mother, though I'll probably set it in Kashmir, a dodgy topic in India. But, I'm trained in German philosophy, for instance. I just don't. Maybe I should just give in and write that Indian book and carry on. You know, I have heard that in different folk cultures, the Native American storytelling tradition, the Navajo storytelling tradition, pictures words as birds, which I think is beautiful. Kamara Laye, the West African writer, wrote Guardian of the Word about the griots. The Talmud has a prescription against writing, right? And it was actually a source of great grief to Jews when things were eventually written down. This idea that I think it has to do something with making the imaginative captive somehow, and there was a fear that when you are speaking extempore, there is an articulateness and an edge to your thinking. And the best analogy I can make is think about anything you write and then feel compelled to go back and revise. And I think when we write, we become our own worst editors in a way. I don't know of any writer who writes an entire page and steps back and says, voila, this is just magnificent. You know, it's part of that kind of self-consciousness is part of the game. Whereas the word, once it's spoken, it's spoken. And therefore, you have the epics, for instance. There's a lot of controversy in the 1950s about the inconsistencies in the Iliad. The fact that it is not chronological according to the books, that the later books have elements that were historically older than the earlier books and so forth. And Milman Parry, an American ethnographer in the Balkans in the 1920s, studied Balkan storytellers and found that not only did these people literally recite for days on end, but the immediacy that they brought, I mean, they often went into trances, or in the case of this Moroccan chap, he would pick up themes from the various people who were participating and make sure that people remained in the same space, and a story that began as a Dan Brown novel didn't suddenly morph into Harry Potter, for instance, that it remained a Dan Brown novel and was uniformly miserable.